Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and Cedar Mountain was a stellar moment for Hill, but he would go on to distinguish himself much more at the next engagement, Second Manassas. The year before, he had been a colonel and had missed the battle. He returned to the same battlefield of First Manassas, a major general, and would take a prominent role in the battle. On August 29th, Hill displayed his tenaciousness in battle. When John Pope's Union Army moved against Stonewall Jackson's line, A.P. Hill's Light Division constituted the left wing of Jackson's line. Gregg's South Carolinians were on the extreme left, Thomas was in the center, and Field was on the right of Hill's line. Generals Archer, Pender, and Branch were placed in the rear of the main line. The Union brigades that hurled themselves against the Confederate line concentrated on Hill's division, attempting to outflank Gregg's men. Hill closely monitored the situation, always near the front of his lines, helping to ease the fears of his men by making his presence known in the toughest of fights. Near disaster struck Hill's line when the mostly New England brigade of Brigadier General Grover broke through Thomas's Georgians. Hill immediately went to the breakthrough. He was on foot, organizing troops to push back Grover's men. Amid the chaos, Hill thought of Gregg and the pressure on the left and sent a staff officer to see how the South Carolinian was doing. Gregg said, "Tell him that our ammunition is exhausted, but rocks are plentiful, and we will hold our position with them until we can get ammunition." It took nearly an hour for Hill to push back Grover's men, but with the help of Dorsey Pender's brigade, Grover's brigade was thrown back. Hill dashed off again, this time to Gregg's line personally. He yelled to his troops, "Good for you boys, give them the rocks and the bayonets, and hold your position, and I will soon have ammunition and reinforcements for you." The day was getting late and Jackson sent one of his staff to Hill to get a report. Hill told him that most of his men were out of ammunition, the Federals could be seen massing, possibly for another assault, and that he was hard-pressed. When Jackson heard the news, his face grew dark and said to the staff officer, "Tell him if they attack, he must beat them." The staffer barely left Stonewall's presence before the general rode after him and accompanied him to meet with Hill. In a more softer tone than he had conveyed to the staff officer, he explained to Hill that he must throw back any attack that may come. About that time, a volley of musketry erupted from the front of Hill's line. "Here it comes," Hill shouted. As the division commander rode off, Jackson yelled, "I'll expect you to beat them." A member of Archer's brigade painted a vivid picture of the situation. 3 lines of battle, one after the other, in beautiful order, with banners flying, hurled themselves against our men in the cut. The front line was nearly annihilated, but the second came to the rescue and nearly met the same fate. Such a contest with rocks and butt ends of muskets I have never seen or read of before or since. The maddened men, the flying stones, the clubbed muskets, the shouts, yells, smoke, dust, din, and rattle of that scene passes description. It was a slaughter, but Hill had thrown back a horrible assault on his line. A member of Hill's staff rode to Jackson and reported that the Union attack had failed and Hill's lines were still intact. A rare smile crept over Jackson's face and he said, "Tell him I knew he would do it." The next day, August 30th, Pope attacked Jackson's lines again, thinking him in retreat. What Pope did not know was that Jackson was not retreating and that Longstreet had arrived on the field the night before. When Pope attacked Jackson's lines once again, Hill defended his position admirably as Longstreet launched a major assault against Pope's troops, catching the Union soldiers off guard. When the Yankee soldiers began to skedaddle, Hill ordered his light division to pursue them and did so into the night. It was a great victory. One of Hill's biographers put it best when he said, "Second Manassas was his first major defensive action. He incurred his highest losses of the war simply because he was the chief target of 2 days of Union assaults." He did not allow the heat of battle or enemy breakthroughs to cloud his thinking or shake his confidence. The manner in which he rushed troops to the right place at the right time was a masterly display of coordination. He drove his men hard and demanded much. Victory was the result. Even the usually restrained Jackson wrote glowingly in his official report, "Assault after assault was made on the left, exhibiting on the part of the enemy great pertinacity and determination, but every advance was met most successfully and gallantly driven back." A moment during the battle that shows the complexity of Hill as a human being was when a Massachusetts surgeon was captured during the engagement. The surgeon, while in Confederate custody, began tending to wounded Union and Confederate. When Hill found this out, he gave him all the rights and privileges of a non-combatant and allowed the gentleman to leisurely pass through the Confederate camp without a guard, until a few days after the battle, Hill helped secure the surgeon safe passage into Union lines. Jackson and Hill would pursue the retreating enemy, and on September 1st, Jackson would engage the troops of Philip Kearny and Isaac Stevens. A torrent of rain slowed down the attacks, but the battle still raged. Hill reported to Jackson that his ammunition was wet. Jackson replied, "Give my compliments to General Hill and tell him that the Yankee ammunition is as wet as his, to stay where he is." The battle continued until dark covered the battlefield, leaving 2 Union generals dead, Kearny and Stevens. Hill rode to a cabin alongside the road. Kearny's body laid on the porch. Hill had knew Kearny before the war, and when he saw the body he said, "Poor Kearny, he deserved a better death than that." Robert E. Lee formulated his plan to invade Maryland, and as the Army of Northern Virginia was beginning its march toward the U.S. border, Hill and Jackson began to butt heads. Jackson met with his division commanders on September 3rd at sundown. He wanted the march to begin at 4 a.m. and had all his division commanders set their watches by his. Hill's men would be in the lead. Jackson rode to where the men would be passing by, but no troops were marching. Irritated, he rode over to Gregg's brigade, who had not even broke camp, and asked why he was not marching. Gregg told him that the men were filling their canteens before the march began. At that moment, Hill rode up. Jackson reprimanded him, and the columns began their march. Hill picked up the pace to keep Jackson from complaining about slowness, but this led to heavy straggling. At noon, the columns were supposed to stop for a rest by Jackson's orders. Hill kept the men moving. Jackson was furious and rode to the lead column and ordered them to halt. The rest period passed, and Jackson ordered them to resume the march. Hill, discovering the break in marching, inquired as to why his troops had halted without orders. General Thomas said that Jackson had ordered him to do so. This was the last straw for Hill. He dismounted and stomped up to Jackson. Stonewall had broke military protocol by directly dealing with Hill's subordinates without going through the proper chain of command. He said, "If you take command of my troops in my presence, take my sword also." Jackson told him to put it away, but to consider himself under arrest. Branch was placed in command of the Light Division, and Hill was relegated to marching behind his column of troops on foot. For the second time in 2 months, Hill had been put under arrest, and this time it was on the eve of one of the most dramatic and daring campaigns for the Army of Northern Virginia.